All right, folks, in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and start for today. This morning, we're looking at our final lesson from this particular series on the New Testament survey we've been doing. So we're on week 19, December the 23rd. And what we're going to be looking at basically are the books that I've outlined right up here. We're just going to look at each one briefly. We'll refer to the handout that you have towards the end, okay? But if you remember, back in week 3, when we talked about how we got the Bible, which is called the process of canonization, okay? Determining which books go into the Bible and which ones do not. We talked about a set of books that were called the anti-legomena, okay? That word basically means spoken against. So over the years of church history, these books that we have from Hebrews through Revelation were books that almost didn't make it into the Bible, if you remember, okay? Now, there's 2 exceptions on our list, and that is 1 Peter and 1 John. Those were accepted early on. But as we go through time, and you can go back and review that, you will see that Revelation, for example, Hebrews, James, Jude, these other books that Peter and John wrote were not included in early versions of the Bible. Okay? Those 27 that we have now, early on, those books were not included because there was some dispute about whether they should be in the Bible or not. We'll talk about that as we go through here. Okay? Because remember, to become part of the Bible, to be canonical, you had to have basically 4 things that the book met. Okay? First one was, who was the author? Is the author mentioned or not, and who was the author? If it was an apostle or an apostle's helper or scribe, then the book was accepted. It had to positively explain church doctrine. That was another thing to get into the Bible. Number 3, it had to be accepted by the local churches. And then number 4, it had to be read in the local churches. So if a book met those, then by default it was included in the canon of the New Testament. If it didn't, if it was disputed in some way, then early on you wouldn't find it in there. And as you went through time, most of these books that we have, the books that we have up here, were accepted into the Bible, while others were not. Okay? Now, let's go to our book for a moment, and let's go to the book of Hebrews. And we're going to look at the fill in the blanks and fill in some other information as we go down through here. But the reason that Hebrews was not included early on into the New Testament, because the author is not named. Nowhere in this book does it mention the author. You know, Christian or church tradition has been that it was written by Paul, but as scholars look more deeply into that, there's a lot of uncertainty as to whether it was Paul or not. Because when we look at Paul's writings, and I think Court mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. When you look at Paul's writings, he starts out and he'll be transcribing or saying something, and then all of a sudden he will go off on a tangent, won't he? And then he'll come back, and then he'll go off on another tangent. And he'll come back. It's almost like he had ADD undiagnosed. Okay, but that's the way he writes. When we look at Hebrews, as we'll talk about in a minute, it's very structured, super structured. Okay. Which leads scholars to think maybe it wasn't Paul that wrote this particular book. But when we look at number 1 in your book there, it says, the epistle to the Hebrews is unique among the letters. It dives deep into Jewish theology, is the first word that we're looking for there in the fill in the blanks, and redefines it from the inside out, making Jesus the center. Without a good foundation of knowledge about the Old Testament history and teachings, Hebrews can be difficult to understand. Jews would have no problem with that because that's who it was written to, right? That's why it's called Hebrews. Us, on the other hand, if we didn't have some kind of background as we're reading it as Gentiles, we would have trouble understanding it. Okay? Number 2, the letter was probably directed to Jewish believers. So number 2, the fill in the blank is the word believers. Number 3, the author is never named, and there is no clear clues for a definitive answer as to who actually wrote the book. Tradition claimed Paul, but most scholars would agree it is unlikely because of the writing style and vocabulary, which I mentioned earlier. There's really no tangents in this book. It's very structured. Interestingly, The book of Hebrews, in the original language, is considered the most eloquent and well-written book in the New Testament. Number 4, the structure of Hebrews is easy to follow because the author supplies key words and phrases. And then number 5, there are some major themes that the writer mentions. It says the superiority of Christ over angels, Moses and the old priesthood, Jesus as the great high priest and mediator of the covenant. Great examples of faithful people of God. So that's the word faithful. It goes in that blank. And then the last one, the confidence a believer has before God. The confidence a believer has before God. Okay, next one, James, written by one of Jesus' brothers. Okay? And the reason that James was considered to be part of the Antilegomena, the spoken against books, was because of its discussion between the relationship of faith and works. Okay? Faith and works. Argument was, some people said all you need is faith. James is making the point that if you're not doing something with your faith, then what good is it? Okay? All right, number 1. James's letter is addressed to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ. James clearly intended Jewish Christians, the word's Christians there, to read his letter. The history of the book of Acts records the persecution and scattering of the Christians in Jerusalem. The recipients of this letter were among those scattered and without leadership. Number 2, the letter does not emphasize the theological aspects of Christianity, although it is not empty of truth and about God. Instead, James turns his attention to practical, the word we're looking for there is practical Christian living. Okay, number 3 on the next page. The message of James is similar to the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount and the book of Proverbs. So Proverbs is the word we're looking for in the blank. And then we have some major themes from the book of James. Facing trials with joy and patience. So the word we're looking for is joy. Listening and obedience. Obedience. Walk hand in hand. Favoritism breaks God's law. Faith and deeds work hand in hand. Controlling the tongue. Humbleness is the next fill-in-the-blank word. Humbleness before God. Prayer is always a good idea. So those are some of the major themes that we find in James. Okay? Then we come to 1 Peter. 1 Peter, number 1. 1 Peter is addressed to God's elect scattered throughout and written to encourage and testify that this is true grace of God. Stand fast in it. Peter did not write to a single city. So it's 2 words that go in that blank. Single city or region, but clearly intended his letter to be distributed. So most of these had a focus group or a focused city, a focused area that they were writing to, but that's not the case that we find in 1 Peter. Okay? Number 2, the letter addresses common problems Christians were facing everywhere. Living in a pagan society where few know God or knew God, the Christians were often misunderstood and faced persecution. So persecution is the word we're looking for in number 2. Persecution. Number 3, Peter's letter is pastoral. He wanted to extend his sympathy for their difficult situations and offer advice on how to survive. So the word sympathy. And then the major themes once again. Salvation, plan, and responsibilities included. So the word's plan there. Submission, Christian duty to authority. So we're looking for duty. Suffering. What happens when Christians live a holy life? The word's holy. And then sanctification, process through which Christians become more like Christ. All right, then we come to 2 Peter. I made a note here going back to, once again, to what we talked about in week 3, that this was probably the most heavily disputed book of any of these others on the list right up here. Most heavily disputed because of the different style of writing from 1 Peter. They knew that Peter wrote 1 Peter, okay? The uncertainty became with 2nd and 3rd Peter, just like with 2nd Peter rather. Just like with John, everybody knew that John wrote 1 John, but the discrepancy was what happens with 2nd and 3rd John. Did he really write them or not? Okay? It's been accepted now that Peter did and John did, but at the time the difference in writing style kind of led to some questions about 2 Peter. All right, so looking at number 1, the exact recipients of 2 Peter cannot be determined. The letter is addressed to believers, without mention of location. 2 Peter 3:1 refers to a former letter. This is a reference to 1 Peter. If this is a reference to 1 Peter, then we can assume 2 Peter was directed to the same audience. Okay? But there's really no audience that it's directed to. Number 2, there are many similarities between 2 Peter and Jude. It says compare 2 Peter with Jude 4:1 through 8, those verses, because it's only one chapter. Verses 4 through 18. It says, many believe one borrowed, the word is borrowed, from the other, or that both had a common source. And then number 3, although this letter is short, 3 chapters, its message is still important. And then some of the major themes, the call for spiritual maturity. So the word we're looking for there is maturity. Prophecy is a reality because it comes from God. So our fill in the blank there is God. Warnings against false teachers. False teachers. And then waiting for the coming day of the Lord. All right, let's come down to 1 John. It says 1 John was written to believers, although it lacks a specific name for a particular community. Internal evidence suggests there was a division, so the word we're looking for is division, within the Christian community, and John wrote this letter to reaffirm the truth about Christian community. Number 2, the beliefs of the other community were an early form of Gnosticism, okay? A mixture of Greek philosophy and Christianity. The word there is Christianity. And then down below, it goes on to explain what the Gnostics believed, which is important. That's what John is speaking against, is this Gnostic philosophy that's starting to creep into the early church. And remember, we're in less than the first century of the church, right? So we're talking about early on, the beginnings, and there's already false teachings that are starting to creep in, and one of those is Gnosticism. So it says, Gnostics believed and taught the following. Physical things are evil, and God is pure spirit, which is good. So they believe basically that Jesus didn't have a physical body. He just came as a spirit being of some type. That's what a Gnostic would tell you. Okay? Salvation comes through having the right knowledge or secret wisdom. The right knowledge or secret wisdom. Jesus wasn't fully God, only an emanation of God. This spirit being, if you would. Okay? He wasn't really a physical person. He was a spirit being. Jesus was good and didn't have a physical body. If only the spirit is good and the flesh is evil, if Jesus is good and perfect, he can't have a physical body. That was the reasoning. And then because the body was evil, this led to either self-indulgence or self-mutilation. Mutilation is that last word we're looking for there. Okay? Number 3, John reestablished basic Christian beliefs and taught that true knowledge is reflected in one's lifestyle. So the word we're looking for there is lifestyle. And then some major themes. God is seen as the light, righteousness, and love. So our first blank is love. No one is without sin. Sin. Warnings against antichrists. Believers are the children of God. Jesus was the God-man who suffered to save the world. So he's making the argument that Jesus did come as a human being in the flesh. He had a physical body. Salvation is secure and certain for believers. Okay, let's go to 2 John. Once again, the reason this one didn't make it into the Bible because the author's not identified. The author refers to himself as the elder or the apostle, but he never really gives his name in 2 John. All right, looking at number 1. The 13 verses of this letter addressed to the chosen lady and her children. Scholars are divided in their treatment of this verse. Some believe this letter is written to an actual person. Others believe this address to be a metaphor for a church community. So the word that we're looking for there in number 1 is metaphor. Metaphor. Number 2, in the early days of the church, wandering teachers spread the gospel. Christian communities were to welcome them into their homes and provide them with food, shelter, etc. False teachers also made use of their hospitality to, there's 3 words, spread lies. So the last blank is to spread lies for number 2. Major themes. Loving one another means obedience to God's commands. Warning against welcoming false teachers, as doing so helps them. Okay. 3 John, once again, doesn't identify the author. Does not identify the author. Just a couple of things there. It says the 13 verses of 3 John are addressed to Gaius. This letter also deals with Christian hospitality and traveling missionaries, is our blank there. Missionaries. John encourages Gaius to be faithful in the work he is doing for the brothers, even though they were strangers to him. And then number 2, one church leader was neglecting his duty of hospitality. Hospitality is the word we're looking for there. And even excluding Christians from church fellowship for welcoming missionaries. So that's kind of what they're saying John was written to, or 3 John was written to address. Then we come to the book of Jude, which was written by one of Jesus' brothers. Okay? James, one of Jesus' brothers. Jude, one of Jesus' brothers. I think it's the shortest book in the Bible, if I remember correctly. It's just 1 chapter is all that it is. Okay? And the reason that it was part of this Antilegomena, the books that were spoken against, is because it references 2 books that are not in the canon. They're not considered to be inspired books. And that's the Assumption of Moses and the book of Enoch. If you look at verse 9 and verse 15, it pulls some passages out of those books and references them in the book of Jude. So that raised some questions about whether Jude should be included in our Bible, the canon, or not. Okay? All right, number 1. The letter from Jude is addressed to believers in general, although he deals with a very specific problem. Jude wrote about the salvation we share to contend for the faith that was once for all entrusted to the saints. Due to the heavy use of Old Testament history, the readers were probably Jewish. In only 25 verses, Jude's arguments are clear and to the point. The church to which he was writing was infected, is the word we're looking for, by false teachers who had secretly slipped in and changed the grace of God into a license for immorality. And then number 3, these false teachers were immoral, living self-indulgent lives and opposing the truth. So the blank we're looking for there is the word truth. And then lastly, some of the major themes includes warnings against false teachers, examples from Jewish history, so the word's history that we're looking for in that next blank, and then a call to build up in the faith. So the word faith is what we're looking for next. Okay, now we come to everybody's favorite book, and that's the book of Revelation. Okay, we're just going to look at it briefly here. The first thing I want you to understand is Revelation was the most questioned book that's included in our Bible. A lot of people hang their faith on that book. But it's the most questioned book that's included in our Bible. Can you think of any reason why? It's a logical reason. End times. There are so many ways to interpret it. I've given you 5 right up here. 5 different ways that Christians interpret this one book. That's why it's considered the most controversial and highly questioned book in our Bible. Because of the imagery that's used. Okay? So just understand that as we talk about it. The most controversial, but yet there are a lot of people who will hang their faith on that book. Interesting. Okay? Number 1. The book of Revelation stands alone. It's the only one like it in the New Testament. Okay? It says, although it's technically an epistle written to 7 churches, and those churches are listed in the margin of your book. Okay? Among Christians, no other teaching or text creates more controversy, debate, and confusion. That's why it almost didn't make it in. Number 2, Revelation is unique in the way it teaches God's truth. One doesn't need to read far before fantastic imagery is found. The language and symbolism are difficult for a modern reader to understand. Did God intentionally choose, is the word we're looking for, to make His message obscure, or could the original intended readers understand it? It was not difficult. Difficult is the word we're looking for there. For the original readers, they were familiar with literature which used imagery like that found in Revelation. The truth Revelation teaches requires, the word is requires, imagery. Because John is seeing things that's hard to explain. So he had to have some way to try to explain it to us. John is giving us a tiny view of heaven and the future. Revelation is not alone in its use of imagery. Just go to the book of Daniel. You'll find all kinds of imagery in the book of Daniel. All kinds. Okay? Jesus used parables to describe the kingdom of heaven. That's a form of imagery, right? The truth, let's see, got that. Many have noted a strong connection between John's language and the imagery in Revelation and the Old Testament book of Daniel, which I just mentioned. One who is familiar with Daniel will be well equipped to understand Revelation. Scholars normally structure Revelation in 2 ways. Letter A, by events. And then it goes on to list the events that they're talking about there. B, by visions. And then it lists some examples of the visions that are given in the book. And then number 3, the return of Christ and the consummation of this age, the new heaven and the new earth. All right, come down to number 4. Another new unique element of Revelation is found in its use of the Old Testament. Although there is no direct quotations of the Old Testament, in the 404 verses of Revelation, 278, well over half, okay, contain references to the Old Testament. Number 5, one common pitfall to the interpretation of Revelation is focusing on prophecy and not Jesus Christ. We get caught up in the prophecy and not how we see Jesus Christ in this book. Although readers are called, blessed is the one who reads the words of prophecy. That's verse 1-3 of Revelation. A person must be careful not to forget Jesus' warning in Acts 1:7, which says, "It is not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by His own authority." And Jesus makes it plain Himself, He doesn't know. He doesn't know. Okay? Number 6. There are 4 major ways to understand and interpret Revelation. The first one is futurist. Futurist is listed there. It says everything in Revelation describes the future, specifically events preceding and following the return of Jesus. This view holds that no events described in Revelation have happened yet. So everything that we see here has not happened yet. That's one way to look at it. Historicist. Okay? This view sees Revelation as describing historical events beginning with the time of the apostles. Thus, many of the events described have already occurred. Because Revelation was the last book. It was written in 95 AD. Okay? Under the reign of Domitian, who made Nero look like a saint. If you do any studying on Domitian, he made Nero, who we're all familiar with, look like a saint, as far as persecution of Christians was concerned. So that's when John is writing this book. Okay? Thus, many of the events described have already occurred. There is not much agreement amongst scholars on how specific passages in Revelation correspond to historical events. In other words, there's a lot of controversy on how all this relates to historical events, even in John's time. Okay? I'm not going to even pronounce that next one. It says, this view sees the entire book of Revelation as a description of events only within John's time. Okay? This means everything described in Revelation has already happened. And then the last one is the idealist. It says Revelation is seen as poetry, symbolic and spiritual in nature. This view finds a spiritual lesson in every verse and sees Revelation as having nothing to do with actual history. Okay? And then number 7, it says ultimately John was a pastor and he wrote Revelation to encourage and correct churches. Not only did they need to have their behavior, that's the word we're looking for, need to correct their behavior, but they needed to know the hope that God would one day defeat evil. Okay? Life was difficult and still is. Without hope, it is impossible. The devil won't exist forever. Jesus will return for his church, and believers will live eternally in heaven. The central purpose of Revelation is to communicate a message of hope. Is the last word we're looking for there. Now, let's very briefly, let's look at the handouts that you got there for just a minute. The first few pages are just simply, what I'm trying to do there is provide you just an explanation, if you would, of what we're talking about right up here. The study of end times is called eschatologically, okay? And there are basically 4 views, in addition to what we've talked about in our book up here, of how you can interpret the book of Revelation. If you flip over to the last page in your handout, there's a chart there that tries to give you a graphic view of what each of these mean, essentially. Okay? So the first one you've got is that post-tribulational premillennialism. Okay? What that basically is saying is, as you can see on your handout, there will be a time of tribulation that will occur. Great suffering. Okay? Then Jesus will return, and he will set up a kingdom on earth for 1,000 years. That's called a millennial. Okay? That's where the word millennialism comes from. Millennia means 1,000 years. Okay? And then after that 1,000-year reign, there will be a great judgment of all the world, essentially. Okay? And each of these beliefs up here, or ways of interpreting Revelation, are all related to what you think about that millennial reign. When do you think this 1,000 years will or has occurred? That's what it all comes down to. Okay? That's why each one of these ends with the word millennialism. It all has to do with that 1,000-year reign. The next one is called pre-tribulational, dispensational premillennialism. Okay? Now notice what happens in it. You've got the second coming, which is called the rapture. The word rapture is not found in the New Testament. However, it's referred to. If you go to Revelation 3:10 and read it. If you go to 1 Corinthians 15:51 through 52. If you go to 1 Thessalonians 4:15 through 17. They seem to indicate that prior to this great tribulation, the rapture will occur. And all those who are in Christ will be saved from that great tribulation. Okay? Sure. Revelation 3:10 seems to indicate that in the book itself. And then 1 Corinthians 15:51 through 52. Paul talks about those who are still alive will be caught up in the air with him when Christ returns. And remember, Paul's thinking it's going to happen then. The next day. The next minute. That's the way he lived. All of these writers, that's what they were expecting. It's going to happen right now. Not 2,000 years down the road, right now. And then 1 Thessalonians 4:15 through 17. So in that model, what you basically have is the rapture that occurs, this 7-year tribulation, the second coming of Christ with the church, all those who were captured taken up during the rapture. Then you have this 1,000-year earthly reign. That's what that millennium means. And then you have the last judgment.
Can I ask you something?
Sure.
If they were all writing about it, was that before John? They're talking about it.
They're all. What I mean is they're all expecting it to happen.
Before John wrote about it.
Oh yeah, these guys were expecting Christ to return. They're not expecting these events to take place. They're expecting Christ to return at any moment. That's the key. Okay? Now John starts to talk about what that's going to be like, you see. But these guys were expecting Christ to return. They're expecting the second coming at any time, any moment. All right? Next one is called postmillennialism. All right? What that one basically means is that Christ will rule, but not from a literal throne. He doesn't come down to earth, in other words, and rule from a literal throne, set up an earthly kingdom for the 1,000 years. Okay? So it's not really a literal 1,000 years that John is talking about. Okay? And then the last one called amillennialism. The A means no millennia, in other words. That one basically believes that the kingdom or reign started at the resurrection. So this 1,000 years that's being talked about by John is not a literal 1,000 years. It actually Jesus' reign actually started at the resurrection and still continues today, and we're just waiting on His return, is what we're waiting on. Okay? Now, the one that the Christian church really has taught over the years is one that's not on your list. It's called panmillennialism, which basically means it's all going to pan out in the end anyway. It doesn't matter which of these you accept. It's all going to pan out in the end anyway. Because think about it. What does Revelation really have to say to us? What does it really have to say to us? If we cut through all the imagery, we do all that kind of stuff, what does it really say to us?
Jesus is coming back.
Jesus is coming back. Better be ready. More importantly, I think it tells us that God wins. It tells us God has already won. Doesn't it? Because it talks about Satan being defeated, death being overcome, us being in heaven with God, doesn't it? So to me, that's why I adhere to this one. I mean, these are nice to talk about. They're very sexy to talk about. Okay, they really are. They're nice to think about. But when we stop and think about it, what Revelation is really saying to us, I think, is that it's all going to pan out because God is in control. And God has already won. Okay? So, believe what you want up here. Think about it. That's what I've given you the handout for, is to get you some more things to think about. But just realize that God has already won. So it doesn't really behoove us to argue over things like this when we know what the outcome is anyway. We may not know how it's going to occur exactly, but we already know what the outcome is going to be. We do. regardless of what we believe here, we know what the outcome's going to be. Okay? Now, let's stop right there. Okay? Carol, you got any announcements you want to make or anything?
Just next week.